evening, and welcome to the Peace and Conflict News Program. My name is Charles Fenn-Smith, and this evening we will be discussing the conflict between FARC and the Colombian state, as well as analyzing their peace process in recent years, including, of course, as always, certain criticisms. To assist with the story, Peace and Conflict correspondents Juan Pendavis and Diego Rojas will help by offering an in-depth analysis of the peace process, as well as conducting an interview with one of the ex-FARC leaders. However, first off, a general contextual understanding of the conflict is necessary, especially given the incredibly complex nature of the conflict at hand. Now, the FARC, also known as the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or the People's Army, was founded in 1964, when leftist Marxist movements were growing in popularity across all of Latin America. Given that it was formed during the Cold War period as a Marxist-Leninist peasant force, it focused on promoting a political line of agrarianism and anti-imperialism. It also concentrated on the deep inequalities that were associated with the rural population across Colombia. For example, the fact that 30% of land ownership in the country was owned by just 0.2% of farmers within the nation. The FARC expanded its power and influence in the 1980s and 1990s by financing from the drug trade, kidnappings, and ransoms. For the most part, they focused on violent means to spread their message. And similar to other terrorist groups like the IRA, FARC partook in terrorist operations and guerrilla fighting across the nation. FARC actions and the conflict in general became a staple of normal life for more than 50 years in Colombia. The undeniable presence of FARC within the Colombian society was expounded by the fact that in 2007, the FARC claimed they were an armed force of 18,000 men and women. Furthermore, supporting the self-reported figure, the UN estimated that there were around 15,000 active members of the organization throughout the early 2000s. With such a large presence on the Colombian national stage, the civil war between FARC and the Colombian army has come to deeply shape Colombian society, representing a quintessential example of the effects long-standing conflicts can have on their respective societies, especially those conflicts that dictate the everyday lives of normal citizens. In that sense, the all-encompassing and indiscriminate conflict is estimated to have taken 220,000 lives throughout its more than 50-year duration. Given its chronic insult to the well-being of Colombian citizens for many years, the Colombian Civil War was an example of structural violence. Being born out of economic inequality, the FARC movement, through its violent means, was able to restrict the ability of people to meet their basic needs to live. The conflict's structural nature is also due to the fact that it manifested itself as an impersonal conflict, with many innocent bystanders killed in the crossfire between the two warring parties. Thus, a proactive form of peace building was needed in order to stabilize the country and change the status quo away from one that involved war and countless innocent deaths. However, peace building in all senses represents a massive hurdle for governments, especially considering the necessary future maintenance of that same peace. Oftentimes, when conflicts, like the Colombian Civil War, are so ingrained in a certain society, they become intractable conflicts, where there is seemingly no positive outcome available for all parties involved. Other examples of intractable conflicts are the Troubles in Ireland, which were eventually resolved, and the current Israel-Palestine conflict, which seemingly has no end in sight. The nature of these conflicts are underpinned by a lack of willingness or ability to compromise between all the parties involved. With this context in mind, it offers an insight into the incredible task of peace negotiation represented for the Colombian government and FARC itself. Such a complex and long-standing conflict posed a significant challenge for all parties as the world watched on for a solution. So now I will hand it over to Juan to delve into the complex peace negotiation process that took place in Havana, Cuba.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Now, obviously, people, as we've explained beforehand, this Colombia FARC peace process is a perfect and unique example of understanding what is this intractable conflict, or at least seemingly intractable, which was stifled by mediation and multi-party conflict resolution. But we have to touch upon some theory in order for you, our viewers, to truly understand the complexity of the conflict and its peace process. Right? Now, first to define it, this Colombia FARC conflict could be accurately defined as a intragroup conflict, which is rooted in the subversion of the status quo. Now, like many other South American intragroup conflicts, the justification of the FARC is rooted in a legitimate systematic form of oppression, which is rooted, obviously, intrinsically in the nature of the state. Now, unlike examples of intragroup terrorism, such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda, the escalation of conflict is not based in isolated attacks, which are justified by historical oppression or ideology, which is harder to justify. Rather, it is this constant pressure rooted in historical exploitation of the lower class, which is usually the story in South America. Now, the ideology is not a justifier to the escalator of the conflict, that being FARC, as Charlie already has defined their ideology, but rather it is an extension of the revolutionary goals in the group. Hence, what makes the peace process so unique, people, is its subversion of otherwise static goals in this radical revolutionary movement, and a relative success in formalizing and moderating the interests of this subversive group. It is a case study of the status quo for once absorbing, to an extent, a subversive group rather than eliminating it. It is a subversion from the state of the subversion in itself of the subvertive actor. Now, as we've discussed beforehand in the program, and Charlie will put up the slide that we were discussing in this program a couple weeks ago, and the process of moderation is usually one proposed by the status quo rather than subversive powers. This was a very heated position that some individuals in our program had. As we've discussed, usually moderation falls under the realm of what is considered an acceptable procedure by the status quo power. Hence, it is distasteful for obviously subversive actors to partake, as it subverts, through means not acceptable in order to delegitimize and deconstruct the power itself. It is unacceptable. It is in the acceptance of this collectively accepted status quo, which means that these subversive actors become empowered. Hence, as some writers like Beth Roy would put it, there is a reason why status quo actors will consistently talk about Hamas, Hezbollah, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, while rarely having any communication or participation with these actors in any discussion, because it is counterproductive to the intrinsic nature of status quo neoliberal mediation to take into itself actors which subvert the process itself. Now that we understand some of the theoretical basis concerning FARC as a movement, we can now begin to approach the Havana negotiations. Now, the Havana negotiations subverted all that has been explained so far. So everything I've explained, you can forget it, people. The emphasis placed in multi-party mediation and restorative justice throughout the negotiations led to an almost unique absorption of the subversive actor into the system, as we've explained before. Now, the peace process and the Havana peace talks were supported by the governments of Norway and of Cuba, both being guarantors of the final agreement. Now, the involvement of Norway and Cuba intrinsically contributed to the mutual trust of the conflict parties and to the credibility of the peace process. Now, while the involvement of third parties in the drafting of peace agreements does not alter the legal status of the peace agreements, we must take this into mind, people, it contributed to the successful conclusion of these negotiations. Now, the lacking involvement of the international community in the peace negotiations during the presidency of former President Andrés Pastrana, for example, is said to, on the other hand, have contributed to the failure of the negotiation. Now, as we will put up on the screen as well, as we've mentioned beforehand, restorative justice is a concept that we've touched before in this program, and it has played a large part in this process. Now, rather than taking a punitive position, maybe due to burnout, most parties agreed to emphasize restoration, development initiatives, comprehensive or integral rural reform, and development. And hence, development was the first item in the general agreement between the government and the FARC. And a partial agreement was signed in May 2013. Now, as we're going to put up on the screen, there are many ways to promote restorative justice, or at least alternate means of restorative and mediatory positions. Now, the agreement had 4 cornerstones, some of which are touched on this list. Access to land use, the establishment of special development programs, poverty reduction, and the eradication of extreme poverty and food security. Some of the main measures which were laid out were a land fund, formalization of property titles, agricultural jurisdiction to ensure effective legal protection of rural inhabitants' property rights, modernization of the rural cadastre, and the government would delimit agricultural frontiers and protect areas of special environmental interest. And the restorative policies kept going in the original 2013 agreement. Now that we've established the theoretical aspect of the peace negotiations and furthermore some of the conclusions concerning the restorative aspect of the Havana negotiations, I will give the floor to our expert, Diego, who will further on explain to the viewers how some of the criticisms concerning the negotiations. Now, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your insights, Juan. This was very useful to understand the conflict. In the last part and the following part of this news program, we will give some extra analysis of some criticisms of why experts believe that the FARC agreements were not as useful and that have a possibility of failing in the near future. After the experts say, we will have a special guest having a testimony about how people feel inside Colombia and how actually people inside the fields feel about this situation. This person will be an ex-FARC leader known as El Mar. We would also like, and we asked him, the question of what comes next, what people think is the future for Colombia, what people think is the future for the FARC, for the ex-FARC guerrilleros, and to understand if they are going to mobilize again and why. According to expert Ryan Carling, there's one key point that weakened the position of the peace agreements. This key point was mass media and the framing on the solution. For instance, people understand and believe what they want to believe up from mass media and they opt to act in a specific way. When it comes to a solution of political integration, meaning that coming back and giving more or special treatment to the people that in this case were fighting and committed crimes before, people opt to act differently or to think about differently of actually getting into a peace agreement to consolidate these movements. Obviously, from one part, the FARC want to push for this political integration, and obviously some civil societies are not in line with this part. It is said that when in the social sphere there is a debate in this sense, people will support less the option of having a peace agreement. Mass support for integration makes the dealing harder to happen in the sense of people supporting the FARC integration, and if people support this integration as a solution, it makes harder for the government and the groups to reach to an actual agreement. Why? Because the details have to be discussed. If there are more supporters of having political integration, more details have to come into the place, and then into a point there will be less badna in this sense, and people will decide not to negotiate in the sense of not getting what they're actually wanting to in the political sphere, especially talking about the ex-guerrilleros and the way back into society and inside the seats of the parliament. Here we go with the testimony of our guest speaker to understand how and why Colombians feel the way they do. Hello everyone, I'm El Marro and I would like to share with you a lot of the experience that we have been living here in Colombia. We are not happy with the agreements and we are not getting what we actually agreed. There's a general feeling of being left behind. We're still waiting for the promises and we want more transparency and clarity from the government. Urbanization promises and the use of land has not been respected as President Santos told us to be. The difference of change between the government of Santos and the government of Duque is big. We don't have any contact with the government and we feel that we are being left behind. Mr. Santos promised dignity and he promised opportunity for people like us to come back and be citizens of Colombia. But at least in our eyes, we don't feel that way. We feel that this has been a loss of time and we want to continue with the agreements, but in the respectful and having all that was agreed in the beginning. If not, we will not support this. To finish, and thank you very much for letting me be in this news program, I would like to ask all of our international neighbors to please wake up and help us. Remember that last time that you put pressure on our governments and you put pressure on us, we worked together, or we tried to. Now that there's new commissions inside Colombia and that there's more international arbitration, we want you please to be inside the country and to help us with more mediation. And this way we will accomplish to get what we actually accorded in the beginning. If not, we are going to strike back. We don't want to, and I'm not threatening anyone. We just want you to know that we need these agreements. We come back to the studio to finally thank you very much for broadcasting to this new series of newsletter of peace and conflict resolution. We would like to invite you to keep on tuned, keep on touch, and see you next week. Thank you very much, Juan. Thank you very much, Charlie. See you soon.